Hi everybody! So this week I'm going to show you a couple different techniques to either use watercolors or to fake watercolors using markers to make your own postcards that you can send to your friends, your family, people that you are not getting to talk to right now, because one of the big things we do at camp is we write letters all the time. So this is a good opportunity to get into writing letters now. So I'm going to start with the watercolors, and I'm actually going to do that in a separate video from using the markers. But what you want to make sure you have is water, obviously, and some paintbrushes. And you want the soft paintbrushes, you don't want the really stiff ones. Then watercolor paints and watercolor paper. So watercolor paper usually comes in a pad like this. It's a heavier duty paper. You can also use cardstock, but printer paper won't work for this. Printer paper will just get wrinkly if you try to use it. And then you can also use some coarse, oops, that's not on camera, some coarse salt for some of our techniques too. So I'm going to talk you through a few different watercolor techniques and show you what those look like. And then I'll do a separate video to show you the marker techniques. So to start, you want to take a brush, dip it in water, and choose whatever color you want and work your brush into that color until your brush comes out that color of paint. And we're going to start using dry paper. So I'm just going to take my brush, I'm going to make a line across my paper. You can see it's a nice, pretty controlled line, nice and bright. But what happens if I take my brush and I dip it in the water again and go straight to my paper, it's a little bit more water to less paint ratio. It's still pretty bright, but it's not as bright as it was. Then I'm going to dip it again and go back to my paper and do the same thing. I'm just going to repeat that step because we're playing around with the paints right now and getting a feel for them. But I'm going to repeat that step until it seems like my brush has run out of paint. And depending on the paint that you're using and how much was on your brush, you can get a lot of different lines in of different gradients. So this is going to give you a sort of ombre effect from darker to lighter. So you can see I've got really bright to lighter, and it's dripping off a little bit over here where there's more water. That's okay, I've got newspaper down to protect my table. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to work on wet paper. So I'm going to take a bigger brush and paint a section of my paper with just water to start. And I'm going to make it a pretty big section so you can see what it's going to look like. And it doesn't need to be like soaking wet, but you do want it pretty well covered. So I don't know if you can see the shine there, but I have a square or a rectangle painted with just water. I'm going to take that same brush. I'm going to go back to that same color just so you can see the difference. Get it wet. I'm going to start at one end and paint it. So you can see it's starting to sort of blend already. It's hard to do holding it up like this. But when your paper's wet, it blends out on its own a lot easier. So you can see the difference between working with wet paper and dry paper. So when that dries, it looks something like this. So you've got your very clear defined lines, and then you've got more of a gradient here. One more technique I'm going to show you with wet paper is what happens when we use the coarse salt. So again, I'm going to paint my paper with just water first. And you want it pretty wet. I'm going to go back to my paint. And I'm going to fill in that section. I'm going to make sure I've got lots of paint on my paper at the moment. Because the more sort of brightness you have right now, the better you're going to see the difference when you use the salt. So I've got my paper painted. I'm just going to take that salt and sprinkle it on. And you want to make sure you do it while your paint is still wet, because if you let it dry first, that salt is just going to bounce off. So I'm going to let that sit off to the side. And here's one that I did earlier. So I can take it and kind of tap it, get a lot of that salt off. I can brush the rest of it off with my finger. But you see that speckled sort of look? That's what happens where each of those salt crystals was. And so you get that really cool sort of effect. So it's nice for making like water, or you can make it look more like space, all kinds of things. But that's a nice use for the salt. So those are your watercolor techniques. And I will be back with some marker techniques. So for that, you'll want your watercolor paper again, and then just any washable marker. So just regular Crayola markers are great.